So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about swords. Now, normally that would be long swords because that's what I tend to do in HEMA, but I want to talk about small swords. And despite perceived similarities to sport fencing, rightly or wrongly, the small sword is a historical weapon system. This was an actual historical weapon. I would argue it was actually the last historical weapon to see widespread use, at least among civilians. After these things went out of fashion, people didn't really carry swords anymore. So, kind of appropriate as a HEMA weapon system. And I use this for the first time today against somebody. I had made a pair of these, and you'll notice it's got a homemade hilt. The hilt is just made from plate metal and has an oak grip and pommel screwed on there. And so this one has a single shell with finger rings and a knuckle bow. And one of the other ones that I made has a double shell guard and no knuckle bow, just quillions. Um, both based around junior length epee blades, practice epee blades. And the reason for that, of course, is that unlike the foil, which is the traditional practice weapon for the small sword and gave rise to sport fencing, we want our weapons to resemble the actual historical weapon, the small sword. So we go for the epee blades because they have a triangular cross-section blade, and a lot of historical small swords had triangular cross-section blades. So it feels more like the weapon. It looks more like the weapon. Now, they're still flexible for thrust, but the truth is you should really have something on the end. I didn't realize how much it hurt to get hit with one of these. Initially, my first thought was that, well, you could just wear a hoodie and you'll be fine. Uh, you really not only need to have something hard underneath, but you really need to have the rubber tips on too. Because it's amazing. When you just go like this, you figure, oh, it just flexes a little bit. Try getting jabbed with one. It hurts a lot more than I thought. In fact, even with the rubber tip on, getting thrust in the face feels like somebody just popped you with a jab with their fist. It's surprising how much force can be concentrated on the end of something so small and flexible. And keep in mind, I'm used to the longsword. A longsword is pretty big. It's 3 pounds. This is a lightweight thing. Yeah, it's very easy to underestimate. It still hurts. So what I said in my initial there was a video I initially put up about small swords, and in particular making homemade hilts for practicing small sword in HEMA, where I described how I made the hilt. Um, and I said, well, I think you could just get away with practicing this with a fencing mask, light gloves, and a hoodie. The reality is, maybe if you had the rubber tip on and you didn't mind taking a beating, but I honestly think you should have some kind of a protection. If it's not, if you don't have a fencing jacket and you just have a hoodie, then wear one of those plastic things underneath. And that's what I did. I had one of those plastic vests, and it didn't hurt when I got stabbed in the vest, but the vest only covers from here to here. If I got stabbed somewhere else, I could feel it under the arm. So I do stand by, however, what I said about less protective gear is needed. Obviously, it's not as heavy as a long sword, and so it's nice in that sense that it's readily accessible. You can get the blades anywhere. They sell sport fencing equipment. They're relatively inexpensive, around $20 or so. Um, you could easily make your own hilt in an afternoon. I made mine out of just plate metal and an oak grip there. Um, so that's that. And you know, as a HEMA weapon, it's probably the cheapest and easiest to get into, and the one that you probably do need the least protective gear for. But what I said before was incorrect. You do need more protective gear than just a mask, a light pair of gloves, and a hoodie. Because that's what I tried sparring with, and I very quickly found out, ouch, ouch, ouch. And I was told that I had to have the rubber tip on regardless. The rubber tip is bigger, but not all that bigger. But it's the point is it's bigger than this. If you look at the tip that's on the end of one of these things, by itself, that's still going to hurt if it hits somebody and could still even do damage because it's just too narrow. You're concentrating too much force on a really narrow thing. I didn't realize that. So they pack a little more punch than you'd suspect. Again, I got thrust in the face. and it felt like somebody just popped me a good jab. I was like, what was that? you know. Now, granted, I had on my fencing mask, but yeah, it transfers a lot more force than you think when you get thrust in the face. So, the small sword is a pretty cool thing, like I said, and it is probably one of the more accessible HEMA weapons, but it is still a HEMA weapon. It is still a historical weapon system. And like I said, you can, if you base it around one of these fencing epee blades and either make your own hilt or buy a hilt, you can get your hands on one of these relatively cheap. But make sure that you put something over the end, either one of the rubber tips or something else, and make sure you wear something underneath, even if it's only 2 layers of clothes. Wearing just light gloves and a hoodie isn't going to cut it. And I found that out the hard way because I didn't realize when you do get poked with one of these, it feels more unpleasant than I would have imagined. So, yeah, I guess, as a longsworder looking at the small sword, I said, oh, I think it's kind of cool, but yeah, it's not going to hurt. I think I underestimated how much it would hurt. So, and the potential for injury. So, you still obviously need less protective gear than you do for longsword or sword and buckler even or saber. But I would argue you still need, if not a lightweight fencing jacket, then at the very least one of those stab vests. And you know what? When I was fencing, one of the fellow people at my HEMA club, and I had what I'm wearing now, just shorts, a t-shirt, a hoodie, and light gloves, I was absolutely fine. Oh, and I had my fencing mask on, obviously. I was fine. But I had one of those plastic stab vests underneath, and I think that made all the difference. I would not want to get stabbed if I wasn't wearing one of those. And, especially, we're not just talking like poke, poke, poke. We're talking, somebody has their weight on their back leg, has the sword extended, and then they shift their weight and they lunge. That's going to have a lot of weight behind it when it hits you. It's not just gradually pressing on you like that. It's boom, So wear a lightweight fencing jacket or wear a stab vest. And I take back what I said, and I may take down that video. I take back what I said about, being able to spar with one of these in just light gloves and a hoodie and a fencing mask. I don't think that's sufficient for safety. I think you should take one of these. Make sure you have something blunt on the end, either one of those rubber tips or something else there like that. And make sure you're wearing some kind of protective gear on your torso, either the hard plastic stab vest, or a light fencing jacket at a minimum. If you're gonna just try and wear a hoodie, I was wrong. Don't. But what I was right about is that the small sword is a good type of fencing to practice for historical fencing. In terms of you do need less protective gear, and it's also a fun change of pace. So, if you have any interest in this type of historical weapon, and keep in mind, despite similarities to sport fencing, which grew out of the practice weapon for the small sword, which was, of course, the foil. Despite the similarities to sport fencing, this was a historical weapons type. So, people used them in duels. Officers carried them into battle. People defended their lives from ruffians in the streets of London. And, it was a historical weapon. And like I said, if you can get one of these blades cheap, you can make your own hilt or buy a hilt. One of the easiest ways to get a practice one of these things is to buy one of these junior epee blades and then just get a modern foil guard, get a small modern foil guard, like a child size, which is just a domed disc, and then just get a modern saber hilt. So you'll have a hilt, a long handle, a round guard that looks something like this, except domed, and one of these blades. And that's the cheapest way to do it. But it doesn't look very historical. It looks like something you'd see in maybe 1910. if you want it to look like something from the 18th century, you really have to either buy a hilt or make your own hilt, and that's what I did. I made my own. It's not as nice looking, and you can tell that it's made out of just plate metal, but there you go. It was cheap. It took me maybe an hour's time, and yeah, the only thing was to drill a hole in the main plate, and then file it square because that part of the tang is square, and have a spacer that was big enough that it would fit over the square part, but small enough that it wouldn't start, wiggling where it had less room down here. So on one of the swords I made two of these. I put like a brass insert in there because one end was narrower. On this one, I was able to get away with just the tube. I don't know if it's because I pinched it at one end or what, but and then just a bent plate with a hole drilled in it for the tang for the knuckle guard and the finger rings, and then some spacers and lock washer and screw this on. The handle on this is just a piece of oak from an oak dowel. I flattened the sides with a draw knife and sanding it, and I put a spiral groove in there, and then just clear coated it a couple times and put that on. And the other one I made has a double shell guard and no knuckle bow, just cleans. So it's very similar, but yeah, these are pretty darn cool. And like I said, you can get away with just light gloves, fencing mask, a stab vest, or a light fencing jacket, and you're good to go. I wouldn't try to get away with just a fencing mask, light gloves, and a hoodie. I know that's what I said before, but no. Like I said, having just come from sparring with a couple of these, yeah, it hurts when you get poked. And like I said, even a shot in the face, boom, full on, like you feel it. It feels like somebody just popped you one. So as a longsworder, I do think the small sword's cool, but I think you should take a little more precautions than I initially said. I was kind of wrong about that. Just being able to wear a hoodie and you'll be okay. No, you really do. If you're not going to have at least a lightweight fencing jacket, you should have one of those stab vests. And you know what? With the stab vest, I was absolutely fine with a pair of light gloves, a hoodie, and a fencing mask. But without the stab vest, it would have really hurt. So, yeah, the small sword's pretty cool. What do I think of it as a long sworder? I think it's fun. I think it's a neat change of pace. I think it's something cool to learn. But, yeah, it packs more of a wallop than you think. So, just be safe and be sharp. Lone Rider out.